able to introduce my wife as our next speaker, and it's also nice to recall the huge pleasure I recollect now, the huge pleasure I had at being able to introduce Katherine to Dunadd. She hadn't been there before we went up there, early in the early days of our relationship. So it has a special memory there for me. So what I want to do now is to shut my mic off and let Professor Forsyth take us away.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be able to be here tonight to offer a very small token of my appreciation of all I've gained through knowing Ewan as a friend and a colleague over the past 2 decades. I've chosen to talk about a site with which Ewan is intimately associated, as you can see from this photo, which I think has appeared in every one of these lectures thus far. I don't know if the tradition will stop at tonight, but anyway. Not only that, but one where Ewan's scholarly insights have had a very direct influence on my own understanding of what's going on. Dunadd is one of the most significant archaeological sites. Now. Sorry, folks, can't get it to advance. Hang on, I'll go out and start again. I knew it was too good to be true. Here we go. Right, so Dunadd is one of the most significant archaeological sites in Scotland and one of the most important early medieval sites in Britain, and it will be familiar to many here tonight as a high point on the legendary Archaeology of Scotland field trip, level 1 field trip. The site, as many of you know, of course, is a fortified hilltop, a nuclear fort in the Kilmartin Valley in mid-Argyll, important as a royal centre of the early Scots in the Kingdom of Dalriada. The site has been excavated 3 times, most recently in 1980-81 by Dr. Alan Lane of the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cardiff. And as of course you know, Ewan was brought in to work on the finds, which in quantity, quality and range are paralleled only on royal sites in Ireland like Lagore and so on, and are very much above the norm for high status sites in Argyll. I don't need to tell this audience that Ewan's work on the imported glass and ceramics and extensive metalworking and precious metalworking from Dunadd has been transformative. Alan and Ewan's joint work on Dunadd was published in 2000, and they kindly asked me to contribute a discussion of the ogham inscription, which is carved on the living rock inside the fort. I had studied the ogham as part of my 1996 PhD thesis, and I offered a reading then, but in the interim I've had the opportunity to return to the inscription in circumstances which I'll describe, and I've got a new and better interpretation which I first presented at the Ransford na Gaelic conference held here in Glasgow in 2012. So I don't know if any of you were there then. This is a slight reworking of that, but I've had a chance to think about it, and it's great to have the excuse to return to it now. I wasn't sure if I was going to mention this actually, but as Steve's already brought it up, this photo was taken on the aforementioned trip to Dunadd in 1995, when he was obviously still trying to impress me and I was still trying to look sultry. So anyway, that's my first encounter with the Dunadd ogham. Dunadd, the fort on the River Ad, has a rare distinction of being mentioned not once but twice in contemporary sources, the Annals of Ulster drawing on the Iona Chronicle, in such a way as to make it clear that it was of very great strategic importance. It was besieged in the 680s and conquered by the Picts in 735 as part of a major campaign against the Dalriadans. The historical record thus confirms what we know from the archaeology. In the 7th and 8th century, Dunadd was a very important place indeed. So I'm not going to go through the archaeology, but just very, very briefly, what we've got as a series of phases: a fairly modest Dún of the 4th and 5th century, expanded in the 6th and definitely 7th century with the building of enclosure walls, creating the nuclear fort. And this is where a lot of the metalworking and other evidence is coming from these phases. In the 6th and 9th century, there's a major extension of the summit fort and creation of lower enclosures to create a larger fort on the summit. In the 10th and 12th century, there's a bit of a contraction, but there is still occupation at the site, which is important. But beyond the 12th century, it does not appear to have been occupied and had only a symbolic place, although interestingly, it was still a locus for royal proclamations in the late 15th century during the reign of James IV, indicating that even then it retained an aura of political importance. So what I'm going to be talking about today is focusing on the evidence for royal inauguration ritual at the summit, which is sort of indicated by this reconstruction drawing. We've got at Dunadd various elements which draw on a complex of literary and archaeological elements, which are well understood from the wider Gaelic world to do with king-making or rigad. And there's a variety of them here. There's certainly not all elements are present at any given site, far from it, but there is an unusually large number of them are present at Dunadd, and I've just highlighted those here in blue. And of course, a number of these ones, like the poetry, the encomium, the libation, the rod, and so on, those wouldn't show up in the archaeological record, so they may well even have been further elements present. This sort of pick and mix vibe about these elements was highlighted by my colleague Professor Thomas Clancy when he spoke about the choreography of old and new elements that we see in different instances of these sort of king-making rituals. And what we're talking about is a dynamic process of creative reinvention, even if the aim is to give an impression of unbroken continuity from the distant past. This shouldn't surprise us. That is, after all, how all tradition works. In keeping with the other major royal sites, such as Fertiviat in the east or Tara in Ireland, we see at Dunadd a creative reuse of prehistoric monuments to assert authority through appeals to imagined ancient roots. As you know, Dunadd is at the centre of the Kilmartin Valley, which has one of the densest concentration of prehistoric funerary monuments in Britain. And so I think what we're seeing here is an active manipulation of the past to legitimise a changing social order, emphasising a linear relationship between past and present authority. I don't know if it's just me, but I get a bit of a sense of overkill at Dunadd. There's so many of these different elements are present there, and it's almost as if they doth protest too much. And I do wonder, I haven't actually done a comparison, but I do wonder if we have more elements in a single complex than any other attested royal inauguration site. It gives me a sense that perhaps the message was a new one, the political message being expressed, or at least had a new emphasis. One of the key, there's Dunadd there. One of the key insights that Ewan has brought to this is his understanding of what was going on in the 8th and 9th century, in which what's effectively happening is the creation of a stage set for political theatre. So we get a reorganisation to create a new, more restricted, more impressive and monumental approach to the citadel, focusing the attention of those approaching on the platform where the inauguration ritual took place. That was the old way up, a sort of gentle curve up. But this is refashioned by cutting through the rock, removing great slabs to create this very impressive entrance, which is focused on this skyline inauguration platform. So they're creating a very impressive spectacle, and the crowds of nobles and whoever would be gathered for the inauguration were enclosed in a sort of inverted theatre with the actors up on this elevated stage and the audience in a bowl down below, as in this reconstruction drawing here. All the attention of the audience would have been concentrated on the action on the summit, as the high walls of the fort would have prevented a view of the surrounding countryside. But the people on the top are looking out. So what we've got here is an even more developed sense of spectacle and an integration of the constructed landscape with the conceptual landscape. And here I'm bringing in another of Ewan's insights, because up from the top we have, oops. We have what's been described as the best view in Argyll. So this choice of this site is determined by lots of factors other than just simply military strength and strategic considerations. As you can see, it's rather isolated in the middle of this very large bog, which I'll come to again at the end. It's in a liminal position. It's in a border location between Kintyre and Lorne, between the two great kindreds of Kenal Lorne and Kenal Ghavran. But when one is at Dunadd, although one is surrounded by hills, there are, as Ewan has pointed out, freak sight lines, which mean you can see far distant hills which have to call them sacred mountains, I know is not an archaeological technical term, but they all have very particular associations, often associated with the Kayach or other sort of feminine principles. They're very special mountains. So we've got, if you stand with your foot in the footprint, you can see Ben Cruachan, which is 28 miles away, the highest peak in Argyll, one that's particularly associated with the Campbells. Their battle cry is Cruachan. In the opposite direction, you've got the Paps of Jura, and in the other direction, the peaks of Arran. So what Ewan has suggested is that by seeing these different distant mountains, there's different sub-kingdoms which make up Dalriada are united in visibility from Dunadd. So in a sense, Dunadd is a unifying place. Of course, in the 6th and 7th centuries, Dalriada was far from unified politically. The annals are full of the bloody strife between kindreds jostling for wider control, which they're able to maintain only periodically, if at all. But the remodelling that we see around this royal inauguration focus dates to the later period. It dates to the 8th century and beyond. And it's possible to argue that this reorganisation of the royal site had a counterpart in some political reorganisation or expansion, perhaps reflecting a time when the site had become significant not just for the local kindred, the Kenal, sorry, I've got these labelled the wrong way around. I've just noticed that should be down there and that should be up there. That's just a slip of the mouse in haste. Apologies for that. Yes, so rather than it just being a focus for the local kindred, the Kenal Ghavran, it is significant for all Dalriada. And I think if we're looking for a historical moment to situate this, obviously we can't date the archaeological redevelopment this closely, but it's very tempting to align it with political actions by Onoist, son of Urgwist, or Oengus, son of Fergus, who was one of the greatest Pictish kings, one of the dominant figures of British politics in the 8th century, who in the 730s and 740s is successfully campaigning against Dalriada, and in 741 the annals record the smiting of Dalriada by Oengus, son of Fergus. This is the moment in which the Picts take over the political control of Dalriada. They become the over-kings. It's a moment in which Dalriada is brought together in a single unit and subordinated to the Picts. So what role do the carvings play in all of this? Sorry, I forgot this is all animated. There we go. So there are the carvings on the rock. And we can see here that there's quite a constellation. We'll forget King Fergus with his pipe here. There's a bowl, Bolon, slightly separate from the rest. We have a boar, a footprint, and down here an ogham stone, ogham inscription, a 2-line ogham inscription. So there's the bowl. The difficulty is we can't date these. The bowl could go back into deep prehistory, or it might be something that's carved afresh in the early medieval period. We simply don't know. But ballons are a feature of royal inauguration sites, well attested in Ireland. Similarly, with footprints, we have 6 examples of footprints at royal inauguration sites in Ireland, and other examples in Scotland at Southend, at Dunadd and at Finlaggan, and possibly at Cleckhenan in Shetland. So the other question is the extent to which these carvings are part of a single programme, whether they were all carved at once or whether they are cumulative. We can't prove that they date to the same period as the redefinition of the site archaeologically by the building of these ramparts and the new entrance and so on. But there's nothing about them that would preclude that date. So we need to leave that possibility open. I want to focus on the boar and then turn in greater detail to the ogham. But really understanding the boar has a bearing on how we approach interpreting the ogham inscription. So the boar, what is the meaning of the boar? Well, the word for boar in the Celtic languages is torc. We have it attested in all the different branches. But interestingly, in early Gaelic, torc has 2 meanings. It's just the ordinary word for a boar, but it also has an extended meaning, and it can mean chieftain or hero, which is of interest. The sources refer, and I apologise to any Celticists in the audience that I'm going to skirt over the detail, but we have in glossaries a reference to Orc-Thraith, the son of a king. Literally, the orc is a piglet, the young of a pig, and the piglet of a king. And this word thraith is very interesting. It appears, it's another word for a boar, but it means particularly an old boar or the lead boar in a drove. I'm afraid I had to look up on Wikipedia what's the correct term for a group of porcine, but anyway, apparently it's a drove, as in, well, anyway, I'll not get distracted. So presumably it's from that sense that it comes to have the extended meaning of king or chief, or attested in this sense. It also appears in the sense of meaning the sea, or a wave of the sea, and that might be one of the reasons why we get stories of boars, miraculous supernatural boars who are great swimmers. I don't have time to go into all this. I'm just really kind of flagging it up as a sort of indication of the kind of avenues that we could go if we're trying to understand the significance of the boar. But there's some interesting related traditions in medieval Irish and Welsh literature concerning a famous supernatural boar known in Irish as the Torc-Thraith, who seems to be an otherworld king of the boars. There's not very much detail about him. There's more detail about the Welsh cognate Torc-Truith, who is an enchanted prince in the form of a boar, who goes on the rampage across Wales and Ireland. I don't know to the extent to which we have any evidence of similar tales in Scotland, although I would mention the place names, the Boar's Rake, or in Latin the Cursus Apri at St Andrews, and up in Sutherland, Skiriab and Thorc, the Boar's Rake. Whether this is just a reference to the sort of destructive rummaging power of the boar, or whether this is a sort of reflex of that story. But perhaps more relevant to Argylr and to the Campbells are the famous tales of Diarmid O'Doine, of the Fian warrior, who is cursed to be, of Dermot and Grania fame, if you've heard of him, who is cursed to be killed by a boar who was actually an enchanted lad that he had killed. Now, the Campbells traced part of their ancestry to Diarmid and were known in earlier sources as Clan O'Doine and then Clan Diarmid, and took as their clan emblem the boar. So I'm not going to try and unpick all that, and I don't think we really have the sources to attempt to join the dots, but just to give you a sense of the kind of symbolism attaching to boars and the association with kingship that seems to attach to them. What's perhaps of most relevance tonight, though, is the Pictishness of the boar. Stylistically, the way that the animal is drawn is very much in the Pictish style, both in terms of the posture, the joint scrolls, the quality of the carving, and so on and so on. This has long been recognised. It's recently been reaffirmed in detail by Professor George Henderson. The question then is, how come, if this boar is Pictish, how come it is at Dunadd, which is not in, which is part of Argylr? Cecil Curl was the first to suggest in print that it was the work of a raiding party of victorious Picts. And in her later work with Françoise Henri in 1943, she linked this explicitly to the annal reference to the capture of Dunadd by Ogham in 736. And this is a suggestion that was taken up enthusiastically by Radford, by Charles Thomas, and by Jackson. And by extension, if the boar was felt to be Pictish, then the ogham was thought to be Pictish by association. And Jackson put forward this as the only explanation that seems likely. Well, I don't think it's likely at all. There have been dissenters, Leslie Alcock, the Richies were not convinced by this explanation. Why would they leave it up there if it is an assertion? Well, Jackson, he's got this great quote. Yeah, he says it's an expression of defiance set there by the victorious Pictish army after the final sack of Dunadd. It would be a kind of Kilroy was here or Irish go home. I think we'll move swiftly on. Doug MacLean thought perhaps it was, well, hang on. So, well, there are so many reasons why this is unlikely, but the most obvious is that the site was not abandoned. They kept occupying it and they kept living it. So, if it was such an offensive and assertive expression of Pictish superiority, why was it allowed to be there? The whole thing is just completely wrong-headed. I was just going to mention Doug MacLean. He was trying to sort of square the circle by thinking that it could be a memorial to a Pict who fell in the service of Dalriada, imagining Pictish mercenaries in the army of the Dalriadan kings. And like many others, he's attempted to date the boar on stylistic grounds, but always using the raid of 736 as a sort of terminus antiquem, which I don't think is justified. But I think there's a category error here. I think because we think of the Pictish symbols as an ethnic marker, that at the time that would be how they would be used to assert ethnicity as a kind of ethnic tagging. But I think this is completely wrong-headed. I think the message is far more likely to be personal or dynastic rather than ethnic. Also, I think Jackson's sort of view that this was a message that was imposed on the locals by their new Pictish overlords, but equally it could have been an active expression of adherence and loyalty to the new overlords on the part of a newly ascendant local faction which survived and benefited from regime change. But I think to understand it, what we have to do is realise that the boar in Pictish art is not widespread. It is not generic. I think it's quite specific. We have in fact only two examples other than Dunadd. There's this one here from Knock na Gael, interesting place name. This looks to me like a prehistoric standing stone. It's very rough bit of stone. Apparently the locals used to use it for target practice, shooting at it, and apparently more recently throwing beer cans as they drive by, or I should say a demographic subset of the locals. Anyway, so the boar is paired with another Pictish symbol in the typical Pictish syntax, and like so many of the Pictish stones that we have carved on pre-existing standing stones, it's at a sort of strategic rootway point in the landscape. The other example, there's the Knocknagale one beside the Wade Road, this route from the head of Loch Ness to Inverness itself. The other example is just slightly further down the road at Doors, where my maternal ancestors, the Gaelic-speaking Frasers, they were the stonemasons in Doors. Anyway, this fragment of a stone with the characteristics indicating that it is a boar. So these to me are strategically important because they're the kind of exit route from the Great Glen, this major transit route across Scotland from the west to the east, travelling up. There's Urquhart Castle, prominent location mentioned in the life of Columba, while Columba is travelling up to meet the Pictish king. Obvious landing place here at Doors, and then onward travel up. So I think this is significant when we look at Dunadd down at the other end of the Great Glen. It seems, and the other point to make is that artistically, the Dunadd ogham is secondary. I won't go into all the details here, but we can see that it is derivative of these ones. So I would like to see these in terms of the expansion of the power of the dynasty of Onuist, son of Argylr, who are based up here in the north, and that expression of their power being reflected by the use of this emblem, by the use of the boar at this important historical site in the new territory. So now, finally, the ogham. So the stone, the flagstone, the lek, is an important part. This act of standing on the lek is part of the procedure of legitimising the authority of the king, and the stone itself plays an integral role in the candidate's empowerment. These are the words of Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, a good friend of Glasgow archaeology, Professor Fitzpatrick. So the power, the stone has a latent power to determine truth, to determine who is and who is not a rightful candidate. And so the inauguration ritual involves the help and approval from some supernatural being, which is communicated through the stone. So we have a number of references to stones calling out in recognition of the rightful candidate. So, for example, the ancestor king Con of the 100 Battles accidentally steps on the Leafoil, the stone of destiny at Tara, and it cries out beneath him, a great cry across the plain. Much later, we have a poem addressed to Rheinl, king of Man and the Isles, who died in 1229, and the poem says, addressing him, says, "You will get speech from the slab on Tara's side, Lavra on lake, speech from the side." So Dunadd, so this the presence of a flagstone is we have at least 9 examples from inauguration sites in Ireland. It's well documented, but Dunadd is unique because it literally does speak. It is inscribed. It's the only example which has an inscription on it. So what does the Dunadd slab say? Well, the first question is, what language does it speak? And that is not straightforward. I mentioned, I should say that the vulnerability of the stones was recognised. They were covered up in the 1920s by this box that you can see. That was replaced in the 1960s by this panel which covered the boar, which was the focus of everybody's attention, but the poor ogham stone was left unprotected. Now, Ian Fisher has told me about a trip by the Society for Medieval Archaeology conference in Oban, which went to Dunadd in 1977. And Leslie Alcock was so concerned about how unprotected the carvings were, that he used his influence with the Ancient Monuments Board to get a replica made. And they had a very innovative approach to this. They made a concrete cast of the whole thing, and using an RAF helicopter, brought the whole thing in and dropped it onto the site. So what people saw from 1979 onwards, in fact, it's still there now, is in fact not the real rock, but a concrete cast. The real rock is underneath. It's so well done that I doubt anybody would have known that. There was some loss of detail, and that had an impact on my ability to read the ogham when I visited in the 1990s. Now, I was helped at that time by, and many times subsequently, by these two gentlemen who did so much to, and do so much to advance recording and understanding of early medieval sculpture. On the right, Ian Fisher of the Royal Commission on Ancient Historic Monuments, and on the left, his colleague, the late Ian Scott, who sadly died last month. So I just wanted to make sure that I noted their kindness and help to me over the years. The two Ians independently told me about their interactions with the great Celtic linguist Kenneth Jackson, who was Professor of Celtic at Edinburgh, who was called in to give his opinion on the inscription. Now, Kenneth Jackson was a great scholar, but his natural habitat was the library, not the exposed hillside, and he wasn't comfortable dealing with non-manuscript evidence, and he produced really obtuse and unsympathetic readings of many Pictish ogham inscriptions, and because he couldn't read it, he thought it was unreadable. So he came up with an inscription that is just gobbledygook, this just sums up his kind of attitude, talking about it being gibberish, nonsensical. It's highly, but only a little more nonsensical than some of the other oghams in Scotland, which are very odd indeed. Unintelligibility, which is typical of the oghams of Pictland and not of the perfectly interpretable inscriptions of the Goidelic world. Well, there's a lot to unpick in that, but I'm aware that time is moving on. His pupil, Oliver Paddle, himself, who went on to be a notable Celtic linguist and literary scholar, did a PhD, a master's thesis with Jackson, and produced a more sympathetic reading. In fact, although the transliterations look very different, the way that it's interpreted is because of the way that the ogham script works, that differences over where the stem line is can end up with very, very different readings. You can see, when you look at a drawing of it, and again, this is why it's so important to get out into the field. When you look at a drawing, you think, oh, why didn't they use the fissure in the rock as the stem line to put the strokes on? But they haven't done that. They've actually used a ridge on the stone surface because the fissures are too big and they're too deep. You'll see that in a minute. So if we look at it, again, I'm not going to, the top line is very damaged and we can only really read the beginning of it. But Paddle is quite right. It reads A-E-S-D. That first word, if we're to read this, if we were expecting this to be written in Pictish, we might look to the Welsh word ice, meaning a shield. If we're expecting it to be written in early Gaelic, then ice is a word that means people, collective term that's used in various contexts. I want to focus on the bottom line though, because that's where I think it's better preserved and we can make more progress. I had originally read it as Vin of Wyn Manach, and come up with various interpretations on that basis. But in 2009, Historic Scotland decided that it was time to check on how well the living rock was faring underneath the cast. And so they arranged for it to be removed. You can see it here, lying, cast to one side. And it was also an opportunity for the Centre for Digital Documentation and Visualisation at Glasgow School of Art to do some laser scanning. And I was very fortunate to be invited up to participate in this and to work on the original surface. And you can see how three-dimensional it is there, and how deep these fissures are. So the computer model, I just sort of very quickly show these as sort of different lighting conditions which allow you to see the strokes and from different with different lighting conditions, picking out different elements of it. And you can see here there's a sort of oblique view, and you can see how the ridge there, these letters are depending off this ridge that's moving along down there. So really you can see it better there from that angle. So really there's not that much doubt. Jackson was just wrong in where he put the stem line. It's really quite obvious if you look at the stone. They also were able to make a 3D cast, which was very useful for studying the inscription away from Dunadd, lovely as it is to have an excuse to go to Argylr. So I did a little project working on these casts, looking at the Dublin Cross inscription and also at the Dunadd ogham. There we go, with all my papers. Very nice way to conduct your research. I just want to focus on this bottom line and offer a new interpretation just very quickly in the last few minutes of this talk. So I think what we've got here is two words. The first word, there's the stem line, if you can see it. We've got 3 strokes, that's a V, 5 strokes, that's an I, 5 strokes, an R, 5 strokes, another R. So there's really not any doubt in it. Now, I've said V, this is a sort of letter character which in the earliest forms of the ogham alphabet would have been a W sound, but as the language is developed, this W sound in archaic Irish becomes a F sound in Irish and Scottish Gaelic. This same sound becomes a Gw sound in the Brittonic languages. Certainly in Welsh it becomes Gw. In Pictish it may have stayed just as W. So already you have to make a decision, which language are you expecting? Are you expecting it to be Gaelic, in which case it's a F, or are you expecting it to be a Brittonic language, a Pictish language, in which case it might be W or Gw. So with could be fir, men in Gaelic, or gwir, men in Welsh. The same word appears in both languages. Second element, we have M-O-N-A-I. Now, is there anything beyond that? Very hard to say. No evidence that there is, no real evidence that there isn't. It is be really nice if there was a D there, but I can't say one way or another. It's just not obvious. I think this word mona is a Gaelic word. I think what it is the word moan, meaning a bog or a peat mass, a peat moss, and occasionally in the wider sense of a moor or a waste. Why on earth would we have a reference to the men of the moan, the men of the bog, up here on Dunadd? Well, those of you who know Dunadd will be one step ahead of me, because Dunadd is situated in the middle of the Moan Yavor, the great bog, this vast expanse of peatland in Argylr, very important scientific, special site of scientific interest, and so on and so on. Time's getting on. I'm going to be brisk, but what I am wondering is if what we have here is in this this text is perhaps, in referring to the men of the bog, a collective affirmation of rightful kingship by those gathered to witness the royal inauguration. Using a geographic rather than an ethnic label perhaps was expedient at this time of political upheaval, just to just as a century and a half later, the geographic term Alba came to the fore as the name of the kingdom, handily avoiding explicit ethnic assertions. So I wonder if this inscription is a reference to the body politic, the collective who are witnessing or endorsing this act of royal inauguration. Yeah, there you can see the position of Dunadd in the bog. Very impressive. Just final slide or two. There's a lot to be teased out here, but I think if this interpretation is accepted, it might prompt a fresh look at some references in texts of the 11th century and older, referring to Ri Monith, the king of Monia or Monith. And in the past, these have tended to be interpreted as a form of the Pictish Monid or Monith, meaning an upland, as in the Mount, Cairnmouth. An element which occurs frequently in eastern Scotland as a place name. But I wonder if instead it could be a reference to this related Gaelic word Monia, which means bog, and not just any bog, but the Monia Moor. And this is a suggestion that's been put forward in the past by scholars such as Watson and Anderson very tentatively suggested this. So we have this reference in Duan Albanach, early 11th century poem referring to Malcolm II as Ri Monith. And from the 1060s, a poem, a Middle Gaelic poem on the birth of Aidan McGavran, again referring to the king as Ri Monith in Margad, the king of Moin or Monith of the market. And the most recent translator of this poem has suggested that this means we should be looking to identify Monith or Moin with a town, the place of markets. But I wonder if instead we should be looking to the evidence of assemblies and feasting at Dunadd into the 11th century to suggest that markets are happening at other places. This is something for the archaeologists to continue. Anyway, I'm not going to go into these other examples, but I think it's something to that this inscription I hope will throw some fresh light on, and I hope it's been testament to the possibilities of mutual enrichment of archaeology, art history, onomastics, epigraphy, literary and historical studies, and the benefits of interdisciplinary working, which Ewan has always been so very supportive of. So I will stop there and thank you very much for your attention.
Right, well, thank you very much for that, and that's a fantastic way to kind of reflect on Ewan's long involvement with that site, and to bring his feet into action. I want to. We'll have time, I hope, for a few questions at the end, but we're going to move straight on to the second speaker today, and this is, again, I have a great pleasure in being able to introduce Adrián Maldonado, who, as you can see here, he's talking about the sculpture from Iona, the stones from Iona, and Adrián is somebody who I've had the pleasure of working with as a student and as an adult now. He is currently the research fellow at the National Museums of Scotland, the Glenmorangie Research Fellow, and he sneaks in as much Iona type work as he can do within the scope of that. So I'll stop now, and Adrián, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thanks, Kate, for that brilliant lecture as well. Hello, Ewan. I've pinned you to the corner of my screen so I can see your reaction as this goes along. I'll be brief. Basically, I just wanted to say, like everybody else in this lecture series, thank you very much to Ewan for all the work that he has helped me with. He was the bad cop on my PhD panel. I was terrified every single night before we had a panel meeting, but it was for the best. It made me do my best possible work. And as soon as the PhD was over, like that, I think we became very good friends. So So thanks for that anyway. Bringing stones to Iona is something that I've been working on with Kate actually for several years now. And there's something about the stone itself on Iona. And it's a funny old thing. It's a strange kind of tourist site, a kind of unique kind of tourist site where you're actively encouraged to take something away with you. In particular, it's these sort of polished pebbles which occur naturally at what they call Columbus Bay on the west side of the island. Local jewelers make a lot of jewelry and other souvenirs with these stones. When they get polished by the water, they become this very shiny and very distinctive green marble kind of color. And there is actually a marble quarry also on the south side of the island. And so there's a lot of sort of tourist and pilgrimage activity actually bound up with the stones of Iona. And that's something that we can expect, you know, from the life of St. Columba and his stories of blessed white stones. We can expect that this sort of engagement with the landscape in the materiality of stone itself is something which probably goes back to the very earliest days on Iona. And just to make a little cute observation as well, you know, the green marble, again, it's become kind of a touristy thing, but you see it also being used in the church itself. Here's a wooden altar, an altar cross. It's I believe this is in St. Oran's, and there you can see on the base of it, first of all, the central crossing is a little polished up circle of this green marble from the island, and then on the base of it, tourists and pilgrims continue to leave more chunks of the rock that they've found, and they've left it on there like a little offering to the altar. So this is the kind of activity that kind of still goes on today. Sorry, that's at St. Michael's Chapel, not the Religorian. Here's a picture of Ewan on one of our drives on the way to recent fieldwork on Iona. He pulled the car over, pulled the Land Rover over, and he got out and showed us this spot over by the river. It was kind of a dreary day, but this was a pretty important spot in Ewan's own timeline. It was that little flat bit there next to the river where he set up his tent for his geology master's fieldwork. Ewan, you can jump on if you like. How long did you actually camp out there, did you say?
Well, it was 6 months, over 2 years.
Crazy days. Okay. Well, there you go. So that was Ewan sort of sharing a little bit of that personal story. This is a geology fieldwork that he did. So after, if you remember, if you attended the first lecture, Ewan starts off as an archaeology undergraduate, but then does a master's as well in geology, something in earth sciences, which sets him up in good stead later on in his work in archaeological science. But it also is kind of the beginning of the story here a long time ago. So Ewan was able to bring in these two sides of his professional work, his studies. First of all, the work on Dunadd and the work on geology that he had carried out on the Isle of Mull. This is in one of his very early articles in the Proceedings of Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1987, where he mapped out a specific kind of cross, one with expanded terminals and related forms of cross, very simple kind of cross, which is pretty strongly tied to the art, the carved stones of Iona itself. And what he was able to do here is he mapped the instances of this specific kind of incised cross in Argylr. And what he found was that it actually correlated very well with quarry sites, and specifically quarry sites that we know are associated with Dunadd. The Loch Sween quarry site is where some of the stone for Iona's high crosses was brought in from, as far as that. The Karsig quarry is the sandstone one, and we have lots of examples of Karsig sandstone in amongst the early sculpture. And this pattern was something that kind of allowed us to maybe test the question that, you know, that there are certain places that are being marked by these crosses, not only because they are maybe hermitage sites. Certainly Carsig and Sgúr have caves, and so maybe they are retreats related to the monastery, but there is something perhaps more socio-political involved here, where the places where these crosses show up might have something to do with the trade and the movement of people to and from the monastery, maybe with regard to these obligations relating to protection in exchange for access to those sources of stone. It just allowed us to sort of say that the geology, the material itself, is important, but also the art is not just art. It is active and it is working and it is communicating things that we lose sight of if we only make a typology of crosses and say, this cross is 8th century, this cross is 9th century, this cross is 10th century. There's a lot more detail that you can get out of the art. Okay, this kind of key insight is something that inspired a lot of our work many years later. Okay, in 2012, Peter Yeoman, then of the former Historic Scotland, commissioned researchers to undertake a new study to kind of catch us up on what we know about the monastery of Iona. Historic Scotland was then re-displaying the site, new signboards, a full sort of redisplay of the museum where the carved stones and the small finds were to be displayed. He tapped Kate Forsyth to do the sculpture, and luckily enough, I was available at that point post-PhD to help her out as a research associate. So we tackled the sculpture. We put together this drawing, all to scale, of all of the sculpture from Iona, 120 plus pieces if you count each individual slab of corner post and cross base. It's the largest collection of early medieval sculpture still existing anywhere in Britain, and in almost anywhere in Britain and Ireland, surpassed only by Clonmacnoise. And so it's hugely important on a sort of national and international scale. But the sculpture was really previously studied from a largely art historical perspective. The Royal Commission inventory cataloged these stones roughly in a typology from simplest to most complex, more or less, with architecture sort of at the end. And because of that, a lot of the attention has been lavished on the high crosses, the 4 high crosses that you can see dominating this image. Although numerically they are far outnumbered by the much simpler, much plainer recumbent stones and incised crosses. And this is where Kate and I actually focused a lot more of our work. And we found out very quickly that we were never going to be able to narrow down dates any further than early medieval for a lot of these stones, okay? So dating by cross type wasn't really going to be how we were going to tackle these. When we actually went to Iona with Peter Yeoman and actually had a fresh look at the stones with our eyes firmly planted on trying to find out what new things we can say about the cross, Kate and I were struck by how we had been looking at these line drawings, these amazing line drawings by the late Ian Scott. We'd been looking at them for so long that we didn't realize that there were, you know, we kind of tend to forget that there's an actual physical stone behind it, and that those drawings are just one interpretation. And what we found was that the range of stones used for these was phenomenally rich. They were not all just local stone. There were stones, stone types being brought from all over Iona itself, the Ross of Mull just across the Sound, from further down the water in Carsig Bay, and much further down as far as the Isle of Lewis and possibly the Isle of Man. So there's a lot going on here, and maybe sort of sorting things out by geology is one way that we can sort of say something new. And again, there is just something really fundamentally striking, and it's down to the color and the texture of the landscape itself. Now, obviously, Iona has been manicured and landscaped over the last 150 years or more for tourism purposes. Okay, but that distinction that you see between the low-lying raised beach here on Iona and the Ross of Mull right across the way with this sort of rough and ready pink granite, that's a real distinction. As you drive across the Ross of Mull and make your way over to Iona, you are passing through these real geological, completely different geological landscapes. And Iona kind of stands alone as well. From east to west, there are two different kinds of base geologies there on Iona. It just gives this really striking feel that it's hard to put your finger on until you realize what's underneath the ground. So that, again, I think this is really part of why the monastery is where it is. There is something very striking, if not supernatural, about this sort of the contrast of colors and hues and textures in that landscape itself. So what of the stones? Another thing that Kate and I realized very quickly is that if you look at the stones with the line drawing, sometimes you get the sense that the shape of that cross is really dictated by what the stone will allow you to do, rather than what you want to do with that stone. So the local geology, some of these are local stones that you see here, can be quite rough and ready. These are almost invariably metamorphic stones. These are, you know, they laminate very easily. They are not very easy to carve, and when you do, it's actually hard to sort of keep that carving from flaking off. And you can see that very clearly on this sort of mica schist there on the right. It's you can barely perceive the cross. So when you look at the line drawing, it's very clear, a barred cross. But when you look at it in real life, it's very hard to tell. And the form of that cross is dictated by that affordance of that stone as much as anything else. There's another thing that it allows you to do, okay? So these stones that laminate, that flake off very easily, have been described in kind of downbeat terms by the inventory, by Ian Fisher's description of them. And he's right, of course. The material used for even this amazing high cross, probably the first in the series here, the transom and upper arm, the shaft rather, is a flaggy microgranulite, fatally susceptible to lamination, and the transom and upper arm are of a mica schist, which provides a coarse material for the sculptor. Why would you go all the way to the Ross of Mull and get stone that was maybe substandard instead of getting a nice sandstone that you could carve more easily? There are other reasons why these might be chosen. There are these sort of links to that particular place. The place of that quarry might have, the memory of that place might have some link in the narrative of Iona. There is another thing that we can sort of suggest, and that's in one of these mica schist crosses. Again, really hard to get this level of detail in that interlace on a stone like this, but when you look at it in certain light and certain angle, you see that it really does gleam, and that's something that you can't capture in the standard catalog photography or in that line drawing. You have to see it in real life. It glitters. And I think that's part of the point. All of these stones that are chosen are substandard for carving, but they are really striking when you see them, and they change in the light. And that's something that people have begun to cotton on to. The way the light hits them and the way that changes as the day goes by is something that Tasha Geffrey wrote a PhD about for the stones of Iona. Another thing that Kate and I realized very quickly was, again, how long the distance that some of these stones must have traveled. They must have traveled by sea. Even the ones from the Ross of Mull, as we'll see later, are almost invariably traveled by sea rather than overland. But in some cases, they came from fairly ridiculous distances for the stones for the size of stone that they are. Most famously, we have 2, maybe 3 stones which seem to have come direct from the Isle of Man. And in terms of the carving, like this stone here, not only the slaty sandstone itself, but the imagery with that sort of themes from Old Norse myth you can see in that boat. In that ship that's depicted there on the bottom on the reverse side of the cross, you can see very clearly are coming from the Isle of Man style of sculpture, maybe in the 10th century. Okay, so whatever's going on the Isle of Man is very intimately tied to what's going on Iona, to the extent that not only are people going to Iona particularly for pilgrimage purposes, but they are possibly bringing these stones along with people, along with the kings perhaps, and the other people who want to be buried at the famous monastery of Iona. There's something about now about taking stones away from Iona, but for a minute there, and it seems to be largely these stones in the Viking Age, that is a narrative about taking stones to Iona as offering and as gifts. Okay, and again, a lot of the stones that seem to have come from the furthest distance seem to have come in the 9th and 10th centuries, as far as we can tell, according to style. You know, we have this story about Iona falling prey to Vikings, and we know that the Vikings attacked Iona viciously several times in the early part of the Viking Age. But that has led to this narrative of complete collapse of the monastery of Iona, which the work of Thomas Clancy, among many others, has shown is simply not the case. The monastery continued to thrive and actually becomes a place where Viking kings, where Hiberno Norse kings of Dublin and Man were able to patronize. This was a center of the conversion of the Vikings rather than a place that they demolished and left behind. We can turn a little bit to the stones. I want to focus on sedimentary stones rather than these really sort of flaky and substandard granites and metamorphic stones. There's this, there's Torridonian flagstone is one of the local types of stone that is available locally on Iona and across the way on Mull. You don't have to look far to get these. And in fact, some of the very earliest ones that we can date, like the one on the top left there, the lapis echodi, which is dated to around the year 600 or so. It's kind of the Iona version of a Northumbrian namestone with an inscription across the top and a very early form of Cairo cross. That's just carved on a beach cobble, polished sort of water-worn beach cobble. And some of these earliest stones are just that simple. Even the most elaborate ones, like one here on your right with a runic inscription on it, probably dates to the 10th century, maybe the 11th. Also of this sort of local flagstone. So you can get some pretty good detail, but the thing that unites all of these that are rendered in this kind of stone is that they are generally in 2 dimensions rather than the relief carved crosses. These are the simple incised crosses, even though again, they carry on in use from earliest days of carving to the last, okay? With Karsig sandstone though, that sandstone that's coming from the Isle of Mull, just across the water, you can do more with this. This is really good carving stone, and you can actually carve this in the round, and you can bring out a much higher level of detail. And if you isolate just those stones that have been identified by the Royal Commission's inventory as being Karsig sandstone, you can see that there are some of these incised crosses, but most of these are crosses either in relief or cross shafts carved in the round. Now, it's very hard to put a number, a chronological date on any of these, really. Maybe the one with an inscription could be as early as the 8th century, but it's hard to date just on lettering alone. You can see that most of these are kind of inching towards the post-High Cross era. When there are ringed crosses on the landscape, they are also being depicted in smaller stones. And that's what you're looking at here. So 8th century, I would say, at the earliest, rather than being one of the earliest stones to be exploited, it is something that comes after a period of experimenting with these other metamorphic stones, like you see on the high crosses. To just take one in particular, there's not much more that we can say about that stone by its carving, but that neat rectangular framing of it is something that shows up on only a minority of stones there on Iona. And in Ireland, these kind of neatly geometrically framed stones are actually quite late, 10th, 11th, even 12th century in some cases, although I don't believe that this one is as late as that. If we look at parallels in metalwork, you can see that that motif of the lozenge in between with the neatly curved arms of that cross, the concave sort of armpits there rather than sunken armpits. You can see that motif generally in 8th and 9th century metalwork. So that kind of helps locate this stone, at least, in that kind of milieu. And it's been argued that the relief carved crosses, even with these simple moldings and with these beaded moldings, like you can see in another sandstone cross there, second from left, these have been argued as being sort of imitations of metalwork crosses, of altar crosses, or inspired by metalwork forms, processional crosses and the like, with the beading representing jewels and those kinds of things. You can see, though, with the other sandstone, they do kind of tend towards the later period. The angel there looking very much like the kind of scriptural crosses that you would get in Ireland, in the High Cross series from the 9th and the 10th centuries. And then as you move on to the right here, you get ringed crosses without sunken armpits, with rectilinear, right-angled armpits, which would appear to be later, although again, you can't really put a date on that. Mostly, though, you're getting these sandstone and karstic sandstone crosses being generally in the 9th, 10th, 11th century date range. One type in particular that is rendered in sandstone only on Iona are these unpierced ring heads. That's where you have a ring-headed cross, but the stone hasn't been carved all the way through. Okay, in Ireland, these have been studied by Dorothy Kelly, who places them in the mainstream. She says there's up to a third of the high crosses in Ireland are this unpierced kind, undecorated, lesser decorated, rather than richly carved on all four sides type of cross. Whereas on Iona, they're a distinct minority. It just shows you that whatever's going on in Ireland is also being reflected on Iona to a certain extent, but a lesser extent perhaps, in the 9th and the 10th centuries. And in this, the other contrast with these is that the ones that she sees in Ireland as being plainer or less decorated are almost invariably rendered in granites, really hard to carve stone. And she says that this is why they choose the unpierced style, because they're intractable stones. That's why they're using that style. We see the opposite on Iona. We see sandstone being used to make these plainer and unpierced stones. So that interpretation, I don't think really holds up on Iona. There's something else going on, and I think it's mainly chronological. I think mainly the sandstone are just later. The last thing I want to say, there are very few stones that we can locate according to the Royal Commission's inventory. They have all been kind of hoovered up into great big piles by the antiquarian interventions in the 19th century and onwards. But there are a small few that we can isolate from the part of the complex that is furthest away from the abbey. That's St. Ronan's, the parish church later, and the nunnery. This area produced some of these crosses, and again, we can see some of our familiar sandstone and karstic sandstone examples among them. Again, it looks like this is a bit of a later development, and certainly karstic sandstone in particular is used at the nunnery much later, around 1200, to make the window and doorway openings there. So I just want to sort of raise the possibility that certain kinds of stones do have a sort of chronological and particularly landscape memory to them. They are not just used because they are very good stone. There's something striking and something memorable about the sources, whether it's the Isle of Man and the story of someone bringing that cross, or whether it's something specific to the source. And I bring up this geological map of karstic where the sandstone comes from, just to raise some of the issues that might be being referenced by bringing this stone in particular to Iona. Now, I owe these photos and these insights to Dr. Alistair White, who's doing excellent work on place names of Mull and Iona at the moment. These are his photos. Okay, karstic by land. The sort of quarry is on the foreshore below, and you can see that it's actually really pretty steep. You're not dragging stones up those hills unless you need to. So very likely these stones are traveling by sea from the get-go. Okay, and this is looking towards the source of Karstic sandstone. You can see it there in the sort of lighter color banding in those cliffs just up ahead. Interestingly, Karstig has an Old Norse name. There are some Old Norse names on the Isle of Mull, which I will direct you to Dr. Alistair White. I think he's in the audience. And interestingly, we know that Iona abbots held land there at Karstig in 1573. And going back to where we started, this is one of the places where Ewan saw these Iona-style crosses incised with barred terminals. They are marking this site, the Nun's Cave, or properly Weave Nun Kailak. This site is one of these places that has this Kailak place name, and we don't know how far back that goes, but there are resonances to that which aren't necessarily to do specifically with nuns, as the English interpretation is. I'll defer to Kate and Alistair to tell us how far back the word Nun's Cave goes in England, in English rather. But there is this very early link there with the caves around the quarry site where the Karstig sandstone is coming from. Okay, so maybe that helps us date this kind of cross to around the 8th century, when they seem to begin to appear in stone on Iona. And one of the places where they're showing up, not just the nunnery, is Cladronan, St. Ronan's, which becomes the parish church later on. This is where 2 of the stones in Karstig sandstone have been found. And again, the nunnery is where Karstig sandstone is being exploited later on in the 13th century for the architecture of the nunnery itself. St. Ronan's is this building here with a new modern roof. It's used as a storage place now. Okay, and just to orient you, there's the abbey. What we know about Cladronan, it has an early burial ground, but the earliest graves were not dated. However, they're on the same orientation as this clay-bonded chapel, which is dated, as far as we can tell, to about the 10th century or so. Okay, so maybe in the 9th or the 10th century, that's when this burial ground, this satellite burial ground of Iona, of the Iona Cathedral, of the Abbey, is being built. Okay, so we are looking at essentially what looks like a Viking-age site here. And just to sort of round things out and bring it back to some of Ewan's most recent work, in an article in Medieval Archaeology, Ewan's gone back to the small finds from several excavations on Iona, and he has pointed out that this discovery from O'Sullivan's excavation is actually a Hiberno-Norse, a very distinctive style of bossed insular buckle, which shows up on Viking graves elsewhere, from the Isle of Man to now Oldham and on Iona. It looks like somebody is being dressed in one of these Hiberno-Norse buckles, perhaps because this was a stray find from the cemetery soils there. All of it kind of points to a later than we think date for that early church there at Cladronan. And it kind of firms up this very understudied and lesser understood Viking age, if you like, 9th, 10th, and 11th and 12th century phase on Iona, which really remains kind of the real dark age there. But just looking at the stones and the material culture, this is the kind of thing that really has a lot more juice left in it. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Adrián. More juice. What can we ask for? More juice, great. Well, terrific. And so that's it's been a very stony pair of talks, and that's always welcome, in my view. I wonder whether we have, I don't know whether Peter Yeoman's with us, and whether we can maybe, if he is, he can unmute himself and shout, because I know Peter had expressed a desire to.
Yes, I'm here, Steve.
Brilliant. Adrián has your slides, right?
Yes.
So Adrián is going to. So before we do this, right, I want to do this. I want to record this And then this will give everyone a chance to think of a few questions. Now, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time for questions, but if you'd like to, put them in the chat and I'll try to pluck them out, and we'll save the chat anyway. And so the speakers will be able to pick up on things if we don't actually get enough time to answer them all. But for the minute, it would be really nice if we could have a few words from Peter. So Peter Yeoman is a former colleague of mine and at Edinburgh Castle, and he's had quite a lot of work at Iona, and is responsible for the program of redisplay and so on, and has worked with Ewan there. So I'll just take it over, Peter.
Okay. Sorry, folks, I wasn't actually expecting to do this tonight. This comes as a little bit of a surprise. Can I move these slides forward? Who's got these slides?
I'll move them for you if you just let me know.
Thanks, Adrián. And first of all, can I say both to Kate and to Adrián, just absolutely fantastic talks, both of you. I came to working on Iona 2012-2013 for the redisplay project that Adrián mentioned, and this depended enormously on their research. And then, of course, most recently, having left Historic Scotland, I was able to take part in Ewan and Adrián's amazing excavation project. Adrián, just move it forward, will you? And yeah, so it was great. Have we got the music? It doesn't matter.
Separate file, yeah. the tremendous experience of working there and redisplaying the sculpture, which was quite challenging, but obviously just making use of the existing space, the existing building, which had already been reconstructed in the 1960s by the Iona community, and where the sculpture had rested, and which I think Kate described so wonderfully well. As a bit of a jumble sale, interpretation-free zone. Stones, as usual, in beds of gravel, or in the case of St. Oran's Cross there at the back on the left, lying down, so that because it was so fundamentally broken, we were able to reconstruct all of those and to create a simple timeline going through the Viking-age stones, and of course into the West Highland slabs as well. Next, Adrián. And with the extraordinary place that Iona is, and trying to not so much as answer the questions, but question the answers, the sort of received wisdom of the place, being able to produce new suite of reconstruction images, which this one is already out of date, thanks to Ewan and Adrián, which is fantastic. There they are there, Ewan as a supplicant in front of St. Martin's Cross, and just pondering archaeologists or boffins baffled in that image there of the extraordinary opportunity that we had to to re-excavate Charles Thomas's trenches, the great detective work that Adrián and Ewan especially have done in being able to re-examine Charles Thomas's very incomplete and it was reasonably well done for its time 60 years ago, but of course pre-radiocarbon dating, getting these amazing radiocarbon dates from this building with the massive foundations and curved corners that you see there,
a building which dates from the 600s, a building that Adamnon walked through. Who knows? Maybe where the Book of Kells was produced, just a fantastic opportunity, one that I was really, I feel very, very fortunate to have been able to be part of, and gaining some kind of understanding, some insights into the realities of well, almost Columba's Iona, maybe a building that was built just a generation or so after Columba's death. And really, thanks to Ewan's work and the remarkably swift publications and fulsome and really insightful publications which have already come out, with both Ewan and Adrián involved and many others, our understanding of somewhere as iconic and so important as Iona in the early medieval world has really been transformed from what we could say about it just 10 years ago to what we can say about it now. And of course, most importantly, in a way, it's provided a firm foundation for going forward. Adrián's already mentioned the place name work that's going on, other ongoing interdisciplinary studies which are going on, and it's great that our level of knowledge has increased so much, and still more juice to come. Adrián, that's it. Thank you.